On the 26th of March of 1211, the second king of Portugal, Sancho I, was dead. He had ruled as a great warrior king in the 1190s and as a crucial populator of the kingdom in the early 1200s, but his successor would be very different. Though medieval kings were supposed to prove themselves on the battlefield, the new monarch, Sancho's son, Afonso, would not be able to do so, for he suffered from the worst disease of the era, leprosy. But this would not be the only challenge that he would have to endure during his kingship, for others would come, including the first civil war in the history of Portugal, as well as a new big Almohad offensive to the peninsula. But in all the time of hardships, this king would leave an important contribution to the kingdom on a matter that neither his father or grandfather had the time to tackle on: legislation. After King Sancho's death, the 26-year-old Afonso succeeded his father as king. Though Sancho I had left his country in a state of peace with his biggest rivals, those being the Almohads and the Leones, he could not foresee the troubles that would come from his very generous testament. There, he had made clear that all his sons and daughters, both legitimate and illegitimate, would inherit vills as well as a lot of money. This would not appease the new monarch, deeply interested in matters of the law, who saw all that property as belonging to the crown. The taste Afonso II had acquired for legislation was crucial in making him the first king in Portugal to show a desire to centralize power. Instead of growing his authority through military conquest, he would do it using the law. So, in 1211, he wrote the first set of laws in the history of the kingdom. His main goal was that every land in the country obeyed the same ruler, that is, the monarch, preventing abuse by the governors of different locations. To enforce the laws on the populace, he established judges of his trust all over the kingdom. When it comes to them, they mostly focused on penalizing robbers as well as those who didn't pay their taxes. Also, this piece of legislation punished those who forced a man or a woman to get married against their will. Additionally, the monarch implemented a policy to ensure that local administrators in various cities could not seize the assets of individuals who were tried for treason and allocate them for their personal gain. Instead, the monarch ruled that such assets should remain with the family of the accused individual. However, in cases where the treason was directed towards the king, the monarch would claim half of the seized assets for the royal treasury. This last measure was clear in showing Afonso's ambitions to centralize power. As it is natural, such desire made many enemies, and the king could barely guess that, by adhering to it, he would bring about the first civil war in the history of Portugal. Still, something worse than that was arriving to Christian Hispania, in the form of one of the largest Muslim invasions the Iberian Peninsula had ever seen. Hundreds of kilometers from the southeast of the Kingdom of Portugal, a large Almohad force of 30,000 men, led by the Caliph Mohammed al-Nasir, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and made its way to Castile. His objective was to repeat the campaigns of Al-Mansur in the early 1190s and conquer as much territory as possible. The king, Afonso VIII of Castile, thus called for the help of other Iberian kings, the French and even the Pope. Though King Afonso II of Portugal was in the tough spot because of the rise of internal conflict in his kingdom, he understood the necessity of aiding the Castilians, so he sent several Portuguese knights to help, but stayed in the country. This was a smart decision, since his opposers could try to usurp him in his absence. On the 16th of July of 1212, the Christian and Muslim army would meet at the most decisive battle of the Reconquista, where the coalition led by Afonso VIII won a great victory over the Berbers, with around 20,000 out of their 30,000 troops having died. It is known the Portuguese infantrymen and cavalrymen were important in this conflict. Furthermore, the Portuguese Grand Master of the Templars in Hispania, Gomes Ramires, gave his life for the Latins. Though the large offensive had been defeated, Afonso would now have to worry with wars of his own making in his kingdom. Afonso's father had left his three daughters the lands of Torres Novas to Princess Teresa, Alenquer to Princess Sancha, and the monasteries of Poças and Aroca to Mafalda. Sancho asked his son to respect his will, which he agreed to, but already as a king he decided that the three of them had to swear obedience to him, and had to pay an amount of money the monarch saw fit to the crown. Teresa and Mafalda immediately refused, for they had already been queens of Castile and didn't want to see their authority diminished. So, they asked for Pope Innocent III's protection, who acted in their favour and placed an interdict on the kingdom in 1212. Even so, the king now ordered for the lands to be handed to the crown, and due to the refusal of the sisters, he ended up besieging Alenquer, as well as Montemor Velho in 1213. But, on the northern borders, the King of Leon, together with two brothers of Afonso, and many nobles who opposed the Portuguese king, invaded and conquered lands in the Minho region. By 1214, the interdict was withdrawn. Afonso searched for peace, but still made demands, those being that the protection of his sisters' castles would be a concern of the Templars, so that the monarch wouldn't have to worry with private lords trying to unite against him inside those strongholds. Still, this conflict would prolong for 10 years, with both parts not reaching an agreement. In 1216, the king saw how divided his kingdom was, due to the nobles joining forces with his sisters against him. So, he launched a huge investigation on the documents that supposedly awarded certain properties to noble landowners. The idea was to be sure the donations of lands were legitimate. This was the beginning of something that would be called the Inquirições Gerais, in English translated as the Royal Commissions, and of the confirmations, which, as the word reveals, would allow legitimate landowners to keep their lands. For the confirmation to be issued, the nobles needed the signature of the king. The problem was, many of them were still protesting the centralizing policy of Afonso and refused to see him person to person. Over the years, the king would launch almost 30 royal commissions to lands, most of them located in the north of the country. His main objectives were to investigate the quality of the land, know why it was not being controlled by the crown, what had been the nature of the donation, that is, succession or ended by a previous king, and most importantly, if the land had been overextended in size by the nobles, which did indeed happen a lot, and caused the crown to receive less taxes. Meanwhile, it was now 1217, and with the focus Afonso had given to the law, he hadn't had the time to expand the territory, which was damaging to Portugal, especially because the Almohads had been defeated at Las Naves de Tolosa and were now suffering constant conquests in the peninsula from the Castilians and Aragonese. Still, the monarch could not occupy himself with leading troops due to his leprosy, so the Bishop of Lisbon occupied himself with assembling an army to reconquer the city of Alcácer do Sal, which had been Portuguese during the rule of Afonso I. By the same time, a crusading fleet docked in Lisbon and was preached to by the bishop of that city. A large number of northern crusaders accepted to participate in the conquest, which would materialize with a great Portuguese crusader victory in October of 1217. Thus, the rule of Afonso II saw Portugal finally getting back on the offensive against the Almohads, which had been stopped since 1191. After the battle for Alcácer, the king continued the conflict with his sisters, having finally, in 1223, settled it by letting them keep the lands. Still, the governors of those would be chosen by the monarch. During the final years of his rule, Afonso protected many religious orders, often donating to them. On that same year, his health started deteriorating, and his leprosy would take his life on the 25th of March of 1223, in Coimbra. He would be remembered to history as the Fat, but a more suiting title would have been the Legislator. Though the 12 years of his rule were marked by a display of stubbornness, shown towards not wanting to recognize the lands of his sisters as being theirs, Afonso was still crucial to the history of the kingdom in many aspects. He assembled the first Cortes Gerais, that is, an assembly of representatives of different social groups to consult the monarch on different topics. He created the first set of written laws in the country, and centralized power, which was important in keeping Portugal deprived of feudalism. Furthermore, though not attributed to him, the reconquest of Alcácer was crucial to keep the Reconquista going in Portugal. Even as a leper, Afonso proved himself able to contribute the best he could to the country on his specialty, the law, and for that he should be remembered in the history of Portugal.